Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elliot Kallen, CEO of Prosperity Financial Group, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Expert. Very exciting today. Topics we don't spend enough time talking about in the international markets today. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about, but we're really going to focus deep down into emerging markets because today we have Kevin Carter from EMQQ, a $600+ million entity, and all they do is emerging markets. So welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Great. And if you want to reach me at any given time, it's 925-314-8503. I'm at Elliot, ELLIOT, at prosperityfinancialgroup.com. And it's www.prosperityfinancialgroup.com. Ask away anytime you want. Give us a ring, and we'll talk about it. So emerging markets. So let's first define emerging markets. First of all, we're talking about investing. Well, the reason we're talking about investing is because we invest for our clients in emerging markets. It needs to be some part of a portfolio. You could argue that it should be 2%. You could argue that it should be 10. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about that the world is bigger than just the developed markets, which is the US, Canada, and the bulk of Europe and Japan. The world is full of emerging markets like India, much of South America. China, I know it's hard to believe it, China is still considered an emerging market. The Far East, the Thailands of the world, and so forth, that sometimes are proxies for China, are part of the emerging markets. So we're going to talk about that too. And why don't you, for us, Kevin, as we get started here, because it's exciting as you define emerging markets, as you look at emerging markets, and I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about India, because we're both very excited about that as an emerging market. How do you look at the emerging markets, and how do you define emerging markets?
Sure. Well, as it turns out, there's actually no official definition, but the emerging markets, the best definition we have is the major index, the MSCI index, which is like the S&P 500, if you will, for emerging markets. So if that's what we define it as, what we're looking at are basically 46 countries. China being the largest, India, again, as you said, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Eastern Europe. And, the reason that people should care about this part of the world is that basically 90% of the world's people live in emerging and frontier markets. Frontier markets are like the junior emerging markets, but this is where most of the world's people are. And about 60% of that is in Asia, and about 20% is in South America and Latin America, and then the rest is scattered around Africa and so forth. But it is it's not just the world today; it's even more of the future, because the demographics for emerging markets, they're very young and their populations are growing, whereas Western economies, Europe, United States, Japan, they have an aging population, whereas India has a very young population. So they're big, they're young. The economies in emerging markets are growing twice as fast as the developed markets. And the thing ultimately, when you take the whole thing apart, the thing that's emerging are the people, and they want stuff. It's the consumption that is the big story. You have 6.5 billion people, and they want all the things that we have and take for granted because we've had them for generations. These billions of new consumers, they want more and better food. They want more and better clothing. They want appliances. They want a smartphone. They want to go to movies and take vacations. They want a motorized vehicle, and they want their kids to go to college. And that's the story. When you really boil it down, that's why you should care about emerging markets and why people should be interested in the asset class. So
Okay.
that is the story.
Good,
6
good
billion
understanding
people
of
want
it.
all the stuff we've got.
Kevin, good understanding of it. So when I think of emerging markets, and I go back a long way, there was so much volatility. One year it went up 75%, South America particularly. The next year it dropped by about the same amount. So timing was everything. But when my clients think about emerging markets, they think this is good and bad, good or bad rather, excuse me. They think about China as the emerging market. And that is probably the 800-pound gorilla of the emerging markets too, I'm sure at this point. And it's a very bifurcated feeling, a bipolar feeling about China. Some people view China as, if you're not doing business in China, you're missing out on this enormous market. And of course, in the last few years, it's been China's cleaning our clock. China's kind of taking over the world. China's seeking, supreme supremacy. China's going to be the next Japan of the 1930s and try to go to war with us or take over Taiwan. A lot of negative headlines with China. There's no question about that. So can you be in emerging markets and not be in China?
You sure can, and that's actually, for a lot of the reasons you described, that's actually a growing trend. The emerging markets ex-China as a strategy has had some traction recently, and we have an ex-China strategy as well. I mean, we have our main strategy invests in all emerging markets, and we invest in the technology part, the internet part. So if you think about the Uber of Indonesia or the Amazon.com of Brazil, those are the kind of companies that we focus on and we invest in. And I'll tell you why we think that that's important. But so we have our main original product invest in all of the 46 emerging markets, including China. We have another product that is without China called FMQQ, which if for any reason you don't want China, maybe you got China somewhere else, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of people that are just don't want to touch China. I think China is grossly misunderstood and over demonized, but for any reason you can go without China, and there's been a lot of flows into funds that do that in the last couple of years. And then you can also, there's a lot of ETFs now that give you access to individual countries or even subsets within individual countries. So you have a lot of options now for emerging markets. But I think that the problem, the biggest problem with emerging markets is that the index that people use, the MSCI, which again people can think of as like the S&P 500, like if that's the MSCI Emerging Markets Index, is what most people use if they buy the Vanguard Emerging Markets or the iShares or what have you. And the biggest problem with those ETFs and the indexes is that in emerging markets, historically, it's gotten better, but it was, it's still awful. A large percentage of the public companies are government-owned banks and oil companies. So Chinese government-owned banks, Brazilian government-owned oil companies. And these are not, real companies when it comes to investing, because, the reason companies have value is because they make profits for the people that own the companies, the shareholders. And the way they grow their value is by growing the earnings, right? The more money a company makes, the more valuable it is. And it's, ultimately it's that simple. The stock market will move around, more volatilely than that line of profits moves. But the problem with these government-owned banks and oil companies is they don't care about growing their profits. First of all, their corruption is everywhere. You have people basically stealing your money if you're, buying a traditional emerging market fund. The best example of this is in Brazil, where the state-owned oil company was being systematically looted by about a half of their Congress people and at least 2 of the past presidents who went to jail for, again, stealing your money. So that's the problem with the traditional approaches, is you have all this legacy economy and corruption. I mean, think about the Department of Motor Vehicles meets, Chevron, or the department, not to disparage any particular organization, but government-owned entities usually don't operate as efficiently as private enterprise, and the chances for corruption and graft are just large, and you don't have to look far. So that's the other thing. But you can definitely go without China, and increasingly people are doing that. And as you know, I think right now, if people are going to look anywhere specifically, it should be towards India.
So let's talk about India for a moment, because India is an emerging market that we're adding to our growth and moderate growth portfolios very shortly. And you can't help but notice You know, there are 1 billion plus people there. It's a relative emerging democracy. There's a lot of graft there too. Let's not kid ourselves. If you go there, you have to bribe your way to anything to get things done. That's India. That's a culture thing, not just an emerging market thing. They have to get rid of that one day, but they haven't done it. China has done a better job of that because they put you to death if you get caught bribing somebody. So it kind of puts it into that. But let's talk about India. I know India, if I'm correct on this, is the largest gold consumer in the world because of jewelry. It's very culturally correct on there. It is the largest consumer of so many foods that are unique to India, but little things like that we think about are yogurt and dairy products are so monstrous out there on there. And it's still considered an emerging market because it is an emerging light democracy. I should say it is a democracy emerging with light capitalism. That's a better way of saying that out there.
Yeah.
With lots of opportunity. Tell me why you like India. I know I look at India as a country way behind China, certainly behind Japan, which is developed, but way behind China with lots of opportunity, but lots of challenges along the way too that could affect investors adversely.
Sure. So let me first tell you just briefly how we approach investing, and then I'll tell you how that is applied to the India situation specifically. So what we do is we invest in, as I mentioned, the internet and e-commerce companies, basically the Googles, Facebooks, Amazons of these different countries, the local versions. And because, as I mentioned, ultimately what the big story is, as I mentioned, it's the consumer that's emerging, right? So you have all these billions of people that are, for the first time, they have disposable income and they want stuff. And so that's a well-documented trend. It's going to go on for a long time. But there's two other mega trends that have now come together at the same time. And they're both mega trends that you and I and certainly likely most or all your listeners have been part of these trends for a long time. And that's why we don't think of them as mega trends. We just think about them as part of our life, and they have been for a while. The first mega trend is consumption, as discussed. Now, the second mega trend is called the computer. So, I've had a computer for over 35 years at this point. But 10 years ago, I got this computer. This computer was a little bit different. It was certainly a lot smaller. And what's happening now is that all of these billions of new consumers in emerging markets, they're getting their first computer today, right? These people have never had a desktop computer. And so the smartphone, which now you can buy brand new in India for $12. If I was on this, discussion 6 months ago, I would have told you could get a brand new pocket-sized supercomputer in India for $50. But in July, Reliance Jio introduced a $12 pocket-sized supercomputer. So that's the second thing that's happening, and it's still early. I mean, every week, 1 million people in India are getting their first ever computer. And the third thing in the story is the internet. I first got onto the internet in 1995 in San Francisco's Marina District with a telephone line and a modem, right? So, I've had the internet for a long time. It's gotten better, but guess what? Most of the world never got wired. So you're combining these three megatrends at the same time. And because none of these, by definition, these emerging market consumers, they don't have the consumption infrastructure that we have, meaning they don't have a bank account and a credit card and a debit card, all right? And they don't have a car, they don't have a Target store. And so they're leapfrogging. So the consumer in the emerging market is getting turbocharged and is in many ways becoming very quickly more digital than us. And so now if we think about how this whole internet and e-commerce thing started on the planet, it basically started here in the Bay Area and the developed world in the year 2000. And from 2000 to 2015, we had this S-curve of growth as the FANG stocks, the Facebooks, Amazons, Netflix, Googles, they took over our world. So that was the sort of first internet wave. China was the second wave, 2005 to 2020, right on our heels. And you had the giant tech companies like Alibaba, out of China. And now there's this third wave coming, which is the India wave. And so a lot of my current, I've been focused on this emerging markets for about 20 years now, but early on it was mainly focused on China. And that you could see the growth was going to happen, and it did. Chinese economy has grown almost 800% since then, and the per capita income went from less than $2,000 to now $12,000. Now, to be a developed market, you have to get to 25,000. So China's still emerging, and it will, unless they change the rules of how they define this. China's only halfway to develop. India is still way down here, but the stage is set for India to have now its growth period like China did. All right. I mean, India looks a lot like China did on paper 20 years ago, but now the world has advanced such that not only is it going to happen like China did, but I think it has a chance to, in many ways, happen faster. And indeed, it already is in some very important categories.
So you're stock picking. We're picking you for our portfolios. And by the way, I'm talking with Kevin Carter, who's of EMQQ Global. They're an emerging market company that we do business with. We pick their products, particularly India, and put it into growth and moderate growth portfolio. And if you want more information about that, why we do that, how we do that, the thought process and information, I'm at 925-314-8503 or Elliot, ELLIOT, at prosperityfinancialgroup.com or www.prosperityfinancialgroup.com. So don't hesitate to seek more information, because this is both exciting and scary for a lot of people on there, because it's not investing in the US's 500 or 100 or 30 largest companies that so many people are used to in the US. It is very different, and you're not investing of the best in London or the best in Paris on your typical international companies as well. You're now going offshore dramatically here. So I'm excited about the possibility of India, and I want to talk about the risk because it is a single country which has risks. I'm not investing in a basket of countries like so many other emerging markets and international markets are. We're really focusing down, drilling down into the country with potentially the highest possibility, probability for success. So we're trying to get the odds on our side. But there are risks there. And I want to talk about some of those risks because I want to make sure that when people hear this, they understand that we're also looking at these risks.
Sure.
We're taking them into account. We're not putting a quarter of your portfolio into India, as an example. We're putting 2, 3, 4, 5% in there, and maybe we're being conservative with that. But you got to begin with some defense before you just get offense here. So I think of risk. I think of single country risk. I think of democracy risks over there. It's kind of a democracy in a world of not a very democratic area of the world there at all. I think of the US dollar. I think of Bitcoin and crypto raping and pillaging emerging markets. I think of gold. They bank so much on the price of gold, and gold is everywhere. I mean, people said we're having a recession, buy gold, and now gold is down significantly again this year. Let's talk about the risk here.
Okay. Well, first, let me give you the big picture risks for emerging markets, and then I'll mention a couple of the India risks. But let me also make sure I go through the case for India, because it really is it's incredibly compelling, and I believe it's the perfect emerging market. I started saying it might be the perfect emerging market, but now that I've been so focused on it for the last year, there's never been anything like it. So but the risks in emerging markets, are many. I mean, it's, the world's a scary and dangerous place, and emerging markets are right out at the front of that. So the risks include war. You have the risk of being canceled from, like, Russia. I mean, we had a couple, or a small handful of Russian internet companies that were great companies, and not really involved, but nonetheless, because they were Russian companies, they were basically marked to zero and kicked off the stock exchange. The stocks all got frozen. So you have political risk. I'd say you have in governance risk, I would call it, at the national level, right? With, Putin and you know, we can name Russia again has been sort of kicked out of emerging markets, but presidents of Brazil, Russia, and Korea have all gone to jail or prison in the last 5 years for different pieces of malfeasance. You have climate risk in a lot of these places. In India, that's one for sure. India, because of its topography, it's a very wet country in the southeast, which is densely populated. And the effects of heat are also making some problems along the river. So, emerging markets are risky, and you have, currency risk, interest rate risks, but the list is long for emerging markets. But let me tell you why I think India really is the perfect emerging market. And I'm going to say it with some conviction. And then once I tell you why I think it's going to keep going well, then I can show you where the risks are, because they're part of India has some unique risks that you sort of alluded to, I think, if not in our previous, call, our planning call. But here's why India looks so good. If you break down, okay, why do we want emerging markets? Like, what are they to start with, and why do you want to invest in them? They got a lot of people. They're young. They're fast growing, and they want they want stuff. They have a growing consumer class. There has never been a country that has those things as much as India does right now. India passed China in April to become the largest population. If you look at the future projections, and most experts aren't very good at predicting future things, but demographers are mathematically advantaged in the ability to forecast how populations are going to grow. And China's population is going to start shrinking. And India, when I got involved with China 15, 18 years ago, it had a very good demographic. But now it's, because of the one-child policy especially, it's now got a much older average population. India has the biggest population and the youngest population. India has 610 million people under the age of 30, right? So the most young people, so it's the biggest, it's the youngest. India has the fastest growing economy on the planet. The estimates for this year are for 6 to 6.5% for this year and next year. They just grew at 7% for the second quarter in a row. So I think that I'm one of many who think it's very possible the Indian GDP numbers are going to be higher than are currently forecast. So biggest, youngest, fastest growing, and it's all about the consumer. And just as we saw in China over the last 15 years, now you have 1.5 billion Indians that want the same sort of things that China has now got, as China went from that $2,000 to $12,000 of average GDP. And so all of those things make India the quote unquote, perfect emerging market, at least in terms of the checkbox. But India has a few other things that really set it apart and make it a unique and once in a lifetime opportunity. I mean, there's not going to be another population of 1.5 billion people anytime soon in any single country. So this is it, and it is happening, and it's happening now, and I think it's going to continue to happen. And the reason that India is happening now is a combination of a few things. First of all, as I said, governance is your biggest risk in emerging markets, right? And I cited a few examples. Not even mentioning the Chinese government and all of the tensions between the United States and them. India has the world's largest democracy. Now, some people might say it's not the strongest democracy or whatever, but it's the largest democracy. And now, the hero of the story in India, at least at the national level, is the Prime Minister Modi. Because what Modi has done in his last 10 years is take the country and pull it out of its socialist bureaucratic ways. And they're not all the way out by any means, but he's running the place like a business. And he's very popular. He's just finishing his second 5-year term. And he will almost certainly get a third 5-year term this spring. And in the 10 years under his leadership, they've doubled all of the infrastructure they had for the first 65 years. In almost every category, they've at least doubled, and in some categories tripled, whether that's miles of highways, electrified railroads. They're rolling out hundreds of their own homemade high-speed trains. So they're finally getting the infrastructure together. When I got involved with emerging markets, 18 or so years ago, China and India were neck and neck. The GDP of China per capita and the total GDP was just a little bit ahead of India. But what you saw China do every year, they got further and further ahead because they were building the world's greatest infrastructure to make products, put it on transportation, and get it to a boat. 80% of the world's products go on a boat. And so they built the world's best infrastructure to do that. India didn't do anything. They sat on their hands. The bureaucracy and the power grid didn't even work. You would have all, these US and other, multinational companies would set up shop there, and there would be brownouts at the Intel factory. I mean, it wasn't, a very robust infrastructure. Modi has finally got that figured out, and he is again the most popular leader on the planet. And going back to the risk element, the high level leadership is really important, and you have high level leadership in the country he's there to get things done, and he means business, and his party is doing a great job. And they've simplified the tax code. They've made it so much easier to do business. All of the taxes and tariffs between states that slowed down transportation and led to this really high logistics cost. They've eliminated layers and layers of this, and it is finally catching up with China on the infrastructure side. And now they're making and manufacturing products there. Apple's going to make 25% of their phones in India. Those jobs are coming from China. So again, India has a government that, in contrast to all of the worst part of emerging markets is the government, you actually get a positive here. But keeping Modi, and again, by all accounts, he will win a fifth term in the spring, and they have no term limit, so he could conceivably go another 5 years. But certainly for the next 5 years, his remaining in place, I think, is very important. Now, here's what really starts to make the India story even more compelling. As some of your listeners know, perhaps India's got a lot of people in the technology sector. And in fact, India has a technology sector that's older than me. Tata Computer Systems, as it was called in 1968 when it was formed. It's now, just call it TCS, but they changed the words that CNS stand for. But Tata's older than I am. So you have the Infosys, the Tatas. These are publicly traded Indian technology companies that have been publicly traded for 30 years. So you have this first wave of technology ecosystem that's again is almost as old as the US technology ecosystem. You have this incredible reverence for education, and you can see in our colleges and our best colleges, there are more and more Indians getting spots. Half of the Ivy League deans in the business schools, I think, are now Indian. 25 S&P 500 companies have Indian CEOs, including Google and Microsoft. So this, again, no other country has anything like that. And then here's the secret weapon. And this is something that I think is very important. And people don't quite appreciate what India has built, and it's called the India Stack. And it's also referred to as India's digital public infrastructure. Now, that sounds sort of abstract and weird, and I think part of the reason because I've known about most of this for a long time, but I didn't really pay much attention to it or to see how it has evolved. But it's an amazing thing that no other country has. And so let me explain what it is. So first, let me tell you what is an example of digital public infrastructure. Can you think of any, Elliot, in your life Have you used any digital public infrastructure today?
Oh, I'm sure I do. I think of public infrastructure, not digital, going way back, would be the US Railroad.
Well,
That
okay,
was
I'm
railroad
talking,
money, it'd be public.
the digital public infrastructure that I am 100% sure you use today is called the internet. That's one example.
Okay,
GPS, if you've ever used GPS or used your phone to map or order a pizza, you've used digital public infrastructure. So those are examples. India has built a series of different pieces to a digital public infrastructure, which they call this stack, the digital stack of India. And this is something that is genius, and no other country, developed or emerging, has this. And here's how it started. It started really simply in the year 2009. And back then, one of the problems India had in modernizing its economy is that very few people had an actual identity card, an official identification. Like very, very few. Less than half of the babies even were reported to the government and didn't even have birth certificates. And so, as you can imagine, it's hard to modernize an economy when nobody can prove who they are. And so they had talked about this for a few years, but in 2009, they decided they were going to start a national identity card system. And the government of India was going to issue a physical card with a unique 12-digit number and each person's photograph for everybody in the country. And as they prepared to launch it, they asked a man named Nandan Nilekani to be in charge of the program. Now, Nandan Nilekani is well known. He's one of the founders of Infosys, and a billionaire, and he's currently the chairman of Infosys, which again is one of the largest of the original Indian technology companies. And Mr. Nilekani told the government that he would be in charge of the program, but that based on his limited experience with the government, he didn't think they used enough technology, and that if he was going to run this program, which is called Aadhaar, which translates to foundation, if he was going to run the Aadhaar program, that every 12-digit number was going to be tied to a human being with fingerprint scans and an eyeball scan, biometric information. And so I heard about this program, and I think I remember the biometric information part, but this was, 14 years ago, and I didn't really pay attention to it. Now, when they launched the program, it was voluntary. This wasn't a big brother thing where they came around, the government came around in trucks and made you line up. You volunteered and went in and signed up on your own. And so that was the beginning of this stack, this Aadhaar layer. And 4 years after that, in about 2014, they added a layer, the next layer, a know your customer layer, KYC. Okay, that would sit on top of the database with the biometric information. And then they started a program, and they said, if you're in the Aadhaar database, you can walk into any bank. You don't have to have anything with you at all. You can open a bank account in a few minutes with your fingerprints and an eyeball scan. Instantly open a digital bank account. So again, I knew about these first two layers of the stack, but this was, 14 years ago and 10 years ago. What has happened is that now every single person, not every single person, but over 95% of the population is now in the database. And using the KYC layer, they have opened 800 million bank accounts. You have 800 million people that were not involved in the formal financial system at all. Okay, and you've given them, now you have all these people in this database, which allows, well, I'll show you what it allows. It allows 800 million people to own bank accounts. And so a lot of the government programs that used to be distributing cash or food, tickets, ration cards or whatever, totally digitized. And you've got almost complete financial inclusion from almost no financial inclusion. So that's the first use of those two layers of the stack. Okay. You gave everybody access to the financial system in a digital way. Now, in 2016 is when this story started, what is looking like this. Like we're going right into a very steep S curve with this. And in 2016, two things happened. The third layer of the stack was introduced, okay, called the Unified Payments Interface, or UPI. So you got ID layer, know your customer layer, payments layer. Now, when they announced the UPI, I also thought it was very boring. It was a QR code-based payments. I thought, well, I mean, I've seen that for years in China. Of course, you're going to have QR code-based payments. I was a little worried that it was a government initiative because, that's the state-owned enterprises aren't really a healthy part of the economy, but I didn't quite realize that it wasn't, really a state-owned enterprise. It was just a government initiative, again, led by Mr. Nilkani. He's the architect of all this. And in addition to it being QR code-based, it's instant and free. It has absolutely no transaction cost. You and I could send $10 back and forth to each other 1 million times, and it would still be $10. And it would instantly go from my account to your account. So they launched that in 2016. Now, the other thing they did in 2016 wasn't part of the stack, but it kind of acts like it. In 2016, Reliance Jio launched the first 4G network in India. And back then, in 2016, a lot of people had traditional cheap mobile phones, but all of the carriers were on 2G. And Reliance Jio got the first 4G license and spent $25 billion to build a brand new from scratch network covering the country. And when they launched, they had a great offer. We have the only 4G network. And if you sign up, we'll give you unlimited voice calls forever. And we'll give you 6 months of unlimited free data. And then we'll have the world's cheapest data after that. Now, when they launched, they had a bold goal. They wanted to sign up 100 million people in a year and a half. Now, back then, if you went into the Vodafone store or one of the other phone stores to get a new phone, it would take about 3 hours. Because the Know Your Customer layer has open APIs, Geo stores, when you went in, you didn't fill out any paper. You just put your fingers down and looked in a camera. And they took that 3-hour business cycle and made it 10 minutes. And they signed up 100 million people in 4 months, 600,000 a day. So this was the first time we got the aha. Wait a minute.
Exciting, Kevin. I know it's very exciting what they're doing over there. And you've made a great case for. I'm going to interrupt you because I want to.
Okay, sorry. It's such an important part. I want to make sure I explain it to people. But the stack is making a lot of these things, commercial things, scalable to the whole economy instantly, including credit, which is coming next.
And I'm sure that, and hopefully that gets just as quick here, because that's good stuff. And I mean, you made a great case for why you love India and why we're putting money into India now. And I love that. Let me ask you one more question about risk, and then this has been great for our people. We've been talking about with Kevin Carter of EMQQ Global, and they're a shop that manages emerging markets money, and we are using them and particularly in India right now, because we think the story of India is a great story. And if you've been listening to this, you can see Kevin's passion for India, and that's just great. And if you want more information about that, give us a call at, Elliot, or give me an email at Elliot, ELLIOT, at prosperityfinancialgroup.com or www.prosperityfinancialgroup.com. That's just great. One more question about risk, because I don't want anybody to think that it sounds too good to be true. Why don't I put all my money in India? And that is that so many emerging countries are tied to the US dollar and to having a strong dollar. And the US dollar goes through cycles. And we went through a very strong cycle, what I call King Dollar cycle, when Trump was president. And it's not a political statement I'm making by any means. And then as the debt has just gone crazy since the early days of COVID, and it's been going crazy for a long time, and then it's accelerated its craziness today, it puts more pressure on the dollar and it weakens the US dollar, which makes it easier for countries to export to us and makes it harder for us to export to them, and weakens their currency in its own way. So we're in a trend, a little bit of a softening dollar until we can get our fiscal act in order and get our arms around debt in a way that's going to make more sense. How is this going to affect India?
Well, I think that emerging markets, they're all always subject to some of these macro risks, like currency and interest rates and inflation and so forth. I think India is actually in a pretty good place fiscally, because what has happened with this digitization is that the economy is gone from 5% paper-based, 95% paper-based cash when the UPI was introduced, to now 80% digital, and so that people are paying their taxes finally. So India's got a pretty healthy financial system, and it's I think less likely than other emerging markets to be susceptible to risks like the ones you mentioned. I think the main risks that I see to India are, again, that Modi. They have key man risk more than any other country, I think. And they also have, there is a history of a lot of sectarian and religious tension, and that's definitely part of the political situation. And so I think you have those sort of risks, and again, the climate risk. But in terms of macro risks, I don't think they're any more subject to them than emerging markets more broadly, and they're probably, I'd say, less susceptible to those risks than most.
Yeah. And we'll keep in mind the risk of war that probably would not include India today, but could include Taiwan and China. And if you're sneezing in emerging markets in one place, you tend to catch a cold everywhere, and that would be including the US as well.
Yeah.
If that were to happen. So if that does happen, word of warning to everybody, patience, we'll get through it. You might have 90 days of some ugliness, but we'll get through all that.
Yeah, let me make one additional risk as it relates specifically to our strategy. So our INQQ, which is how we invest in India, which again is to buy the app economy, right? The travel app, the shopping app, food delivery app, those types of businesses. But it's relatively narrow. There's 25 publicly traded Indian internet companies, so it's diversified within the Indian internet story, but it's still a concentrated group. And emerging market internet stocks have been, a very volatile group. This strategy we have actually at one point was down 50% after we launched it. I mean, we launched it and went down about 50%. The good news is that was a year and a half ago when we launched it, and the Indian internet companies had about an 80% crash starting in November of 21. And so now I think that turns into an opportunity, because most stocks, a lot of stock markets are making new highs. I know we had some new highs in the US market. The Indian internet companies are still 50% below their all-time high. So this is not a group of companies you're buying at a high, but it's definitely a group that you can expect to have meaningful volatility in both directions.
Super. So this has been great. I'm sold on India. I can see why you're excited about it. I think there's phenomenal opportunity there. So I want to thank you for joining us today, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
And if you want more information again about India, why we invest, how we build portfolios, why this is so important to us, and a conversation about that, just give us a ring at 925-314-8503, or the emails that are here and website, and we'll see you again. Thanks for joining us on Meet the Expert. Have a great day, everybody.